Chapter 13. The Civilization of the Moors. The Caliphate of Cordova and the Empire of the Two Shores. By 500 AD, the western part of the Roman Empire was in decline. This was of some importance since the Romans carried the flame of civilization in Europe. Europe, therefore, entered an unhappy period known as the Dark Ages. This period lasted until 1100 AD, often glossed over in history books. Professor Robert Briffault, a keen student of the development of culture, wrote the following commentary on this part of the world history. From the 5th to the 10th century, Europe lay sunk in the night of barbarism, more awful and horrible than that of the primitive savage, for it was the decomposing body of what had been a great civilization. Cities had practically disappeared. They were pulled down and used as quarries to build towers in which a bishop or a baron established himself who could afford some protection. In Nimes, for example, the remains of the population dwelt in huts built among the ruins of the amphitheater. Other towns were completely abandoned. Famines and plagues were chronic. There were 10 devastating famines and 13 plagues in the course of the 10th century alone. Cases of cannibalism were not uncommon. There were manhunts, not with a view to plunder, but for food. It was on record that at the Tortones on the Saône, human flesh was publicly put up for sale. Dr. Briffault was not alone in holding this perspective. The historian Joseph McCabe wrote learnedly on medieval history in his view, none of our modern sophistry redeems the squalor of Europe from the 5th to the 11th century. By the year 1000, Europe was reduced to a condition which, if we were not Europeans, we should frankly call barbarism. Yet at that time the Arabs had a splendid civilization in Spain, Sicily, Egypt, and Persia, and it linked on to those of India and China. We write manuals of the history of Europe or of the Middle Ages, and we confine ourselves to a small squalid area. Russia and Prussia were not yet civilized, and Spain was Moorish, and ignore the brilliant civilization then ran from Portugal to the China Sea. The term Dark Ages only applied to Europe. The rest of the world was not necessarily in a dark age. The Dark Age period of European Christendom actually corresponds to the golden age of Islamic civilization. The Muslim city of Cordova in Spain was much like the modern city by at least 950 AD. It boasted paved streets drained by sewers, raised pavements, and street lamps. Of this city, an old Muslim chronicler wrote the following: Cordova is the bride of Andalusia, i.e. Spain. To her belong all beauty and all the ornaments that delight the eye or dazzle the sight. Her long line of sultans form her crown of glory. Her necklace is strung with the pearls her poets have gathered from the ocean of language. Her dress is of the banners of learning, well knit together by the men of science, and the masters of every art and industry are the hem of her garments. This wonderful city had a population of at least 1 million, housed in 200,000 properties and 60,000 mansions and palaces. Of 2 stories, the grander homes boasted latrines and running water. Fine gardens surrounded the larger buildings. There were 900 public baths and many private baths, not to mention 800 public schools and many colleges. Education was universal, being offered to girls as well as boys. Over 1,000 mosques flourished, of which one, the Great Mosque, is among the great buildings of the world. It had over 1,000 columns made of jasper, marble, and porphyry, and lifted a golden and scarlet roof. At night, lanterns by the thousand of brass and silver illuminated the monument. The burning oil was scented with perfume. Among its surprises are the striking glass mosaics, the ivory and wooden pulpit, the cross-arched sanctuary, the 4 fountains, and the leafy courtyard. Other monuments were equally wonderful. The Al-Zahara Palace, almost a city by itself, had 15,000 doors of brass and iron. Of trade, the Cordovians had access to over 4,000 markets and 80,000 shops. They could buy Chinese tea, Indian spices, Russian furs, African ebony and ivory, and locally made goods. A massive wall measuring 14 miles encircled this busy 7-gated city. The Arab invasion of North Africa was of great consequence. Many Africans fled south from North Africa to the land south of the Sahara. Those that remained were converted to Islam. The Arabs occupied Egypt in 639 AD, Tripoli in 643, and southwest Morocco by 681. In 698, they appointed the Yemeni Musa ibn Nusayr governor of North Africa. Musa wanted to take control of Spain, but feared that an invasion at this time would exhaust his armies. In Spain, the Visigoths, Germans, had been in control for the previous 200 years. They had seized Spain from the rule of the ailing Roman Empire. Though Christians, the Visigoths had become as immoral and corrupt as the previous Roman administrations. The fortress of Ceuta, located on the northern tip of Morocco, posed another obstacle to Musa. Any campaign from Africa against Spain would have to bypass the fortress and the land surrounding it. Count Julian, the master of the fortress, was an ally of King Roderick, the Visigothic ruler of Spain. Julian guarded the region from Arab attacks. Suddenly, however, Julian switched sides. Roderick apparently took advantage of Julian's daughter while she was at his Toledo court. In revenge, Count Julian threw in his lot with Musa. The Count offered Musa knowledge of Roderick's defenses. Moreover, he offered ships that could be used to cross the Mediterranean for an invasion. In 710, Musa sent a reconnaissance mission of 500 Africans, i.e. Moorish Berber, converts to Islam into Spain, led by a Tarif, a fellow African. Of the 500 troops, 400 of them were foot soldiers and the remainder were horsemen. Using 4 ships supplied by Musa, they landed at a port today called Tarifa and plundered Algeciras. The expeditionary force confirmed that Julian's information on Roderick's weakness were true. Tarifa was not, of course, the original name of the port. The victorious expedition renamed the port in honor of Tarif. Incidentally, the Moors at a later date imposed a special tax at this port that today we call a tariff. The following year, Musa sent a second and more formidable African army into Spain. Tariq ibn Ziyad, the Berber Moorish governor of Mauritania, led the expeditionary force of 6,700 African soldiers and 300 Arab translators and propagandists. On landing in Spain, they occupied Mons Calpe, a great cliff, and the surrounding land, where they built a fortress. They renamed this region Gebel Tariq, meaning hill rock of Tariq. In more recent times, the Spanish have corrupted this name to produce Gibraltar. Leaving this base, Tariq led his men in battles against the cities of Algeciras and Cartia. During these campaigns, his armies grew. Thousands of native Spaniards flocked to the standard against the Visigothic rulers. On 18th July, 711 A.D., Tariq's 14,000 troops faced a force of 60,000 led by King Roderick at the Jonda Lagoon. Tariq triumphed. He later seized Arcadonia, Cordova, Ecija, Elvira, and Murican Orabillo. Toledo, the capital, also fell. The Jews of the city handed control to Tariq. According to Professor Edward Scobie, an African-American expert on Africans and European history, a European writer sympathetic to the Spaniards remembered the conquest in this way. The reins of their Moors' horses were as fire, their faces black as pitch, their eyes shone like burning candles, their horses were swift as leopards, and the riders fiercer than a wolf in the sheepfold at night. The noble Goths, the German rulers of Spain to whom Roderick belonged, were broken in an hour, quicker than tongue can tell. O luckless Spain! In 712 A.D., Musa ibn Nusayr mobilized an army of 18,000 Arabs and Africans. Professor C.P. Groves believes that Musa was, apparently taken by surprise at the speed of events, hastened across with an army of the following year, and completed the conquest, thus associating Arab arms with the final victory. They seized Carmona, Cremona, Medina, and Sedona. Abd al-Aziz, Musa's son, commanded the conquest of Beja, Niblu, and Seville. Roderick perished in 713 A.D. Tariq's army, supplied with the reinforcements by Musa, finally defeated him in battle on a mountain range of Segulia. The Visigoth king died in the campaign. A consequence of this victory was that the Africans entered Spain by the thousand. So eager were they to come, says Brunson and Rashidi, that some are said to have floated over on tree trunks. Eventually, Tariq and Musa met up in Toledo. The meeting between the conqueror and his superior officer was not friendly. wrote Professor Lanpool, a venerable authority on the Moorish culture. Tariq went forth to receive the governor of the West with all honor. But Musa struck him with a whip, overwhelmed him with reprimands for exceeding his instructions, and declaring that it was impossible to entrust the safety of the Muslims to such rash and impetuous leading, threw him into prison. When this act of jealous tyranny came to the ears of Caliph Walid, he summoned Musa to Damascus and restored Tariq to his command in Spain. The early years of Islamic rule in Spain were less than stable. From 716 to 747 AD, a staggering 19 governors ruled over Cordova. The Spaniards themselves remained turbulent throughout. Led by Count Pelayo, they engaged in guerrilla tactics. From the mountains of Murcia and Provence, they attacked the Muslim invaders. In 722 AD, the Spaniards scored an important victory at the Battle of Covadonga. They established Christian rule in the Asturias and the northern regions of Spain. Meanwhile, the Arabs and Africans controlled the southern regions. The Muslims took control of land vacated by the Spaniards who had fled north. The Arabs settled the most fertile land of the south and left the Africans poorer land in central Spain and areas closer to the north. This led to another conflict between Musa, the Arab overlord, and Tariq, the African subordinate. In time, African and Arab conflict would escalate. Between 741 and 746 AD, civil war erupted between the two groups. The rebellion originated in North Africa and then spread to Spain. Stability emerged under the leadership of the Arab Yusuf al-Fihri, who became ruler in 747 AD. Yusuf installed members of his family into key positions across the empire. He expanded roads and developed the cities. Able in battle, he won a border war against the Christian regime in the north. He also attempted to make Spain independent of the Umayyad dynasty in the Middle East. Abid Al-Rahman, an Umayyad prince of mixed Arab and African, i.e. Moorish Berber, ancestry, moved boldly to challenge this audacious strategy. In May 756 AD, he defeated Yusuf outside the walls of Cordova. He became the ruler of Islamic Spain and the first of the important Umayyad monarchs. Abid Al-Rahman I was an able ruler. He divided the country into military districts and administered it on this basis, creating a standing army of 40,000 men, mostly Africans. He also began a navy. Attentive to security, he had fortifications built in many of his cities. In agriculture, he made important developments that led to the growth of farming industry. He introduced accurate land surveying, built granaries to combat food shortages, and established effective irrigation canals. From the Middle East, he imported cotton, fruits, rice, spices, sugarcane, and vegetables. In time, these policies stimulated Spanish farming and other industries. Sugarcane and cotton were planted near the Mediterranean coastal regions. Figs and olives were farmed in the south. Oranges and wine were cultivated in Granada and Malaga provinces. Oranges, rice, and palm trees sprouted in Valencia. This region, originally barren, benefited from the Abd al-Rahman's irrigation schemes. Other industries thrived. A silk industry grew up in Murcia. Leatherwork and dyeing flourished in Cordova. Ordnance developed in Toledo. Finally, a ceramics industry prospered in Almeria. The Umayyad dynasty, despite being founded by Arab African, was in fact of such a mixed character that we should not assume that the rulers were black. According to Mr. J. A. Rogers, the great Jamaican researcher, an old Moorish chronicle described the earlier sultans of Spain as blonde, white, copper-colored, brown, reddish, dark, frizzly-haired, woolly-haired, and the like. Mr. Wayne Chandler, an African-American writer, explained how this came about with great clarity. White slavery became widespread in Spain, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. The polygamous family structure common to many African cultures expedited the process of amalgamation, and the consequences wrought havoc upon the inhabitants of the Al-Andalus, i.e. Spain. licentiousness and immorality became more and more prevalent in the Moorish social structure. Predictably, there was a gradual eroding of virtues, philosophy, and the pursuit of cultural excellence. Though Abd al-Rahman did not encourage or personally patronize the slave trade, its continued presence within his empire inevitably led to its collapse. Apart from the Umayyad sultans, who could have been of any ethnicity, the overwhelming majority of Muslims in the country were Africans. Professor Stanley Lane Poole wrote that the Berbers were more numerous than the Arabs. Sharing the view, Professor Jackson wrote that the Arabs were always a minority in the so-called Arab culture of the Middle Ages. Confirmation of this position has come from a somewhat surprising source. A 1992 edition of the journal Human Biology carried in an intriguing article that was entitled Importation Route of the Sickle Cell Trait into Portugal, Contribution of Molecular Epidemiology. The abstract to this valuable article reads as follows. To elucidate the origin and spread of the sickle cell trait into the Portuguese population, we examined 9 polymorphic DNA markers within the B globin gene cluster defining the haplotype. The population sample included 64 sickle cell gene-bearing individuals from defined Portuguese-speaking white, black, and Asian Indian populations. The nature and geographic distribution of the different BS haplotypes in Portugal suggests that the sickle cell trait has been imported twice. Between the 8th and the 13th centuries from the Mediterranean basin, in association with the Benin haplotype, and after the 15th century from Black Africa over an Atlantic route, Senegal and Bantu haplotypes. There are a number of different sickle cell haplotypes. Among them are the Benin haplotype, the Senegalese haplotype, the Asian and the Arab haplotype, etc. Had the Islamic culture been predominantly Arab, it would have been the Asian Arab haplotype that would have been introduced into the Portuguese population between the 8th and the 13th centuries, and not the Benin haplotype. Furthermore, the researchers have been able to distinguish between the sickle cell imported after the 15th century from the sickle cell imported between the 8th and the 13th centuries. This separates the sickle cell introduced by enslaved Africans from the introduced by African conquerors. This is strong evidence that the majority of the Moors/Berbers were Negroes who carried the Benin haplotype into the Portuguese population. If they did this in Portugal, then they certainly did this in Spain. According to Marcus Hadstein, editor of important modern work on Islamic culture, the Arabs in Spain were mostly Southern Arabs and Yemenites. Even today, many of these people are Negroid. Taken with the Africans, we conclude that the Islamic culture of Spain was largely a Negro achievement. The Muslims that an ordinary Spaniard would have seen in charge of their destinies would have most likely been Moor or Berber, or if not, a Southern Arab. For this reason, the culture is known as the Moors in Spain. This is a reference to the black color of the conquering group, whether from Africa or Southern Arabia. Even if the Umayyad rulers, after Abd Al-Rahman I, were of ethnicity depending on the color of their enslaved mothers, it is, of course, important to note that the intermarriage was going on in the opposite direction too. For example, J.A. Rogers informs us that Alfonso VI, white Christian king of Spain, took a Moorish wife, the lovely Zada, who was the mother of his favorite son, Sancho. Hisham I succeeded his father in 788 AD, inheriting the throne aged 30. At the palace, he gathered poets, scholars, and scientists and created an intellectual culture in the land. In addition, the chroniclers remember him as the amiable and the just, no doubt due to the numberless acts of piety. For example, he welcomed political refugees. In addition, he demonstrated compassion by personally visiting the sick and the disabled, even during stormy weather. On the practical side, he maintained order and security by having guards patrol the streets at night. In addition, he campaigned against the Christians of the north. He also displayed fortitude against the conspiracies of his uncles. To this effect, He had 1,000 Turkish guards protect his palace night and day. Finally, he rebuilt the Bridge of Cordova, a not inconsiderable engineering feat. In 796 AD, Al-Hakam became the next ruler. His reign was characterized by political instability and brutality. In 803 AD, he faced a rebellion in Toledo. A number of newer Islamic converts rose up against him. At a feast, supposedly of reconciliation, he had 5,000 of these opponents killed. 2 years later, he faced a conspiracy to unseat him. Suppressing this challenge, he had leading Cordovian nobles crucified. Following this, he gathered a force of 5,000 Slavic mercenaries to guard him. Years later, new problems emerged. A Cordovian suburb revolted, blaming harsh taxes that Al-Hakam himself instituted. The Sultan's response, brutal as ever, was to order the destruction of the suburb and the exiling of 25,000 people to Africa. 2/3 of these were sent to Alexandria. The remainder were sent to Fez. Abd al-Rahman II ascended to the throne in 822 AD. This enterprising sultan converted the city of Cordova into a rival of Baghdad. He built palaces, laid out gardens, and raised mosques, constructed bridges. Professor Stanley Lane Poole commented that 4 people ruled him throughout his career. 1 was a singer, the 2nd a theologian, the 3rd a woman, and the 4th a black slave. The most influential of these was the theologian Yahya, the same who had stirred up the students against Hakam, and who now acquired an absolute ascendancy over the mind of the new sultan. The queen, Tarub, and the slave Nasir, however, exercised no light authority in the political matters. Apart from Yahya, Tarub, and Nasir, the 4th influence of which Professor Lane Poole wrote in Zirab, the black Middle Eastern gentleman entered Spain in 822 AD. The leading musician and song stylist of his day, he founded the first conservatory of music in Cordova. An exquisite trendsetter, he revolutionized upper-class ideas of refinement and manners. He introduced the idea of changing one's wardrobe of clothes to follow the 4 seasons. Moreover, he popularized certain perfumes and the use of deodorant. Table manners did not go unaffected. Ziryab started the trend for the use of crystal tableware to replace goblets. Finally, he changed the custom of serving the different dishes of food all at once to the new style, beginning with the soup starter, followed by the main course, followed by dessert. Sultan Abd al-Rahman II and his successor did, however, face challenges from Christian fanatics. The very tolerance of the Moors only exasperated such fervent souls. They preferred to be persecuted, like the saints of old. They longed to be martyrs, and they were indignant with the Muslims because they would not persecute them for righteousness' sake, and ensure them the kingdom of heaven. Especially hateful to these earnest people was the open gaiety and sensuousness refinement of the Moors. Their enjoyment of life and all its pleasure, their music and singing, their very learning and science, were abhorrent to these ascetics. Life to the true believer meant only scourges and fasts, penances and confessions, purification through suffering, the mortifying of the flesh, and the sanctifying of the spirit. What happened was, in truth, nothing but the manifestation of the ascetic or monastic form of Christianity among the subject populations. A sudden and violent enthusiasm took the place of the indifference that had hitherto been the prevailing characteristic of Spanish Christianity, and a race for martyrdom began. The strategy these would-be martyrs adopted was to publicly blaspheme the Prophet Muhammad. The Islamic authorities begged these people to retract, not wishing to have them executed, but they persisted. This episode only came to an end during the time of Abd al-Rahman II's successor. On 11th May 859 AD, the Islamic authorities executed Eulogius, the spiritual leader of the Christian fanatics. Muhammad I followed Abd al-Rahman II on the throne. During his troubled reign, from 852 to 886 AD, much of the empire fell. Toledo became independent in 852 AD. Murcia became independent 13 years later. From the north, King Alfonso III of Leon, ruler of the Christians, seized Muslim territory. Muhammad was compelled to sue for peace with Alfonso in 883 AD. A year later, Umar ibn Hassan, a ruler in the south, extended his power from Cordova to the Mediterranean. Umar's actions further weakened the hand of Muhammad. During this confused period, some Moors seized other territories in southern Europe. Moorish domination, wrote Professor Scobie, extended to parts of Italy. In 846 AD, they held the city of Rome in a state of siege, while in 878 they captured Sicily from the Normans. 20 years later, the Moors took control of southern Italy by defeating Otto II of Germany. As in Spain and Portugal, miscegenation took place on the wide scale between the Moors and the Italians. Like Portugal and Spain, the blood of Africa permeated through all the layers of the Italian society and found its way into leading families, including the most illustrious royal families of the times, the Medicis. In 912 AD, Abd al-Rahman III became ruler of Spain. Starting his second period of achievement, by the following year he seized Seville. Years later, he captured Merida, still under the rule of the Hassan clan. In Africa, he was proclaimed ruler of all Mauritania and Fez, thus establishing the empire of the two shores with a court in Africa and one in Spain. To administrate these territories, he instituted a strongly centralized government founded on an efficient bureaucracy. He established good municipal administration paid for by an effective tax system. Trade developed by the encouragement of agriculture through extensive irrigation, exploitation of the mineral resources of the land, and trade concessions for Jews. Finally, he built the palace city of Medina al-Zahar and gathered poets and scholars at his residence. Al-Hakam II succeeded him in 961 AD and ruled for a credible 15 years. As crown prince, he was fond of books, scientists, and scholars. On the throne, he sent agents across the Islamic world to procure books and compendia. He gave the agents large budgets to spend on scribes, scholars, and copyists. In a Cordovian library, the Sultan gathered 400,000 books accompanied by 44 volumes of indexes. In addition, he commissioned scholars to write books on ethics, statecraft, and genealogy. He encouraged the study of geography, agriculture, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics. Moreover, he established schools and centers of learning for people of all social classes. Joseph Yakub wrote an excellent account of the intellectual culture of this period. Books were now in such demand that Professor Ribeira estimates Cordova alone produced 70,000 to 80,000 a year, all beautifully handwritten and very richly bound. The old parchment roll was discarded, and the manufacture of paper, which the Persians had learned from the Chinese, occupied large mills at Extavia. The Caliph had a superbly housed collection of at least 400,000, some writers say 600,000 books in rich bookcases. Courtiers and rich merchants followed his example, and libraries of 10,000 to 50,000 works were found in the mansions of the wealthy. Even the humbler classes thirsted for books, says Ribeira, and the servants or ladies of the harem were of a higher price if they were well read. The wit of the learned is as precious as the blood of the martyr. A popular proverb ran, one copying shop at Cordova employed 170 women, and women authors were highly esteemed. At this time, a number of houses of learning were established in Christian Europe. There was one in Barcelona, Toulouse, Marseille, Lyon, Segovia, etc. They existed to translate Moorish and Arab texts from the original Arabic to Latin. In 978 AD, Al-Mansur, a Yemenite noble, was elevated to power. Like the previous rulers, he was a patron of the arts and the sciences, but also able in warfare. Swelling the army with Africans, he is said to have won over 50 campaigns against the Christians of the north. Finally, he ordered a census of the city of Cordova. It revealed that the city had 213,077 houses for the working and middle classes, 60,300 palaces and mansions, 80,455 shops, 600 public baths, and 471 mosques. Some scholars who suggest that 1,000 mosques would have been nearer the mark have considered the last figure of 471 too conservative. Cordova had become one of the greatest cities the world has yet seen. After much analysis of the old Islamic documents, Lady Luggard wrote an accurate and picturesque account of the city, its sophistication, and the scientific culture. The town in the time of Almohades measured 24 miles by 6, the greater part of which area was covered by mosques, palaces, and the houses of the great standing in beautiful gardens. These houses were palaces of luxury, magnificently decorated, cooled in the summer by ingeniously arranged draughts of fresh air drawn from the garden over the beds of flowers, chosen for their perfume, warmed in winter by hot air conveyed through pipes bedded in the walls. There were bathrooms supplied with hot and cold water. There were boudoirs, drawing rooms, libraries, halls, corridors, and galleries lighted by windows of clear and colored glass. Clusters of columns of marble, either plain or encrusted with more precious substances, supported roofs of mosaic and gold. The walls were decorated with mosaics or covered with arabesque and floral paintings. The furniture was of the most precious and varied description. It was made of sandal and citron and other woods brought from the tropics, and curiously inlaid with mother of pearl, ivory, silver, and gold. There were tables of gold set with emeralds, rubies, and pearls. In winter, the walls were hung with tapestry. The floors were covered with thick Persian carpets, of which the most magnificent were embroidered with gold and pearls. There were luxurious couches piled with pillows. Vases of porcelain and crystal were filled with flowers. Rare and curious objects from all over the world were brought together to satisfy the eye and taste. In the evening, the rooms were lit by wax candles, which were distributed by groups of hundreds in chandeliers that hung from the ceilings. Great skill and taste were devoted to the design and workmanship of these chandeliers. They were often made from the metal found in the bells of Christian churches, and when this was the case, there seems to have been a special pleasure in designing them for the use in mosques. One famous chandelier is mentioned, which held no less than 1,804 candles. The gardens in which the great houses stood are described by every writer in terms of rapture. Bowers of roses, orange and pomegranate groves, shaded walks over which lemon trees were trained, so that the fruit when ripe hung down like little lamps. Successions of color and perfume to procure which plants were brought from all parts of the world. Sometimes, to please a favorite wife, a whole hillside would be planted with her chosen color. The use of water was thoroughly understood. Fountains, cascades, and lakes gave coolness and moisture to the air, and also provided opportunities for keeping of fish and the special cultivation of water plants. Garden fruits and vegetables were cultivated in a rare perfection and variety. In the gardens were labyrinths and marble playing courts. There were menageries of curious animals and aviaries of foreign birds. Botany, horticulture, zoology, and ornithology were passions no less of the learned than of the rich. Al-Mansur died in 1002. Abd al-Malik succeeded him and ruled until 1008. From this date until 1031, a political unrest grew as less and less able men battled for the throne. Increasingly, power fell into the hands of the foreign mercenaries and military cadres. New threats came from the succession groups. On 30th November 1031, Caliph Hisham III, the last legitimate monarch of the Umayyad line, abdicated. This marked the end of the Caliphate of Cordoba, and also of the important epoch in Islamic and European history. The Almoravid and the Almohad empires. The next part of this story concerns the Berbers of the North and West Africa. In 1048, Yahya ibn Ibrahim, the ruler of the Berbers, made a pilgrimage to Mecca. He returned to North Africa with Ibn Yasin, a religious leader. Ibn Yasin attempted to teach Islam among the Berbers but failed and was chased away. Ibn Yasin and his small band of devotees fled to an island in Turkey on the Senegal River. There, they established a monastery and lived as recluses. In time, they became known as the Al-Morabitun, or Morabites, meaning people of the Rabat. In Spain, this name became Almoravides, the name generally used by historians. In Teruel, the movement grew. Large numbers of Tekurians wanted their independence from ancient Ghana and saw the new movement as a force that could win the independence. In 1052, the Almoravides, now 30,000 strong, invaded Sigilimessa. Yahya served as a general. After this success, they pressed on and took Morocco. However, Yahya died in 1056, and the following year Ibn Yasin died. Abu Bakr, brother of Yahya, assumed leadership of the movement. His conquests extended the empire from Senegal to Morocco. Sometime around 1061, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, a cousin of Abu Bakr, assumed control of the northern territories. In 1062, he founded Marrakesh, the city of Morocco. This city became the African capital of the empire. By 1076, they conquered ancient Ghana and held it until 1087. Tekrur became independent of Ghanaian imperial rule. Sometime in the latter half of 1082, hundreds of Moors and Arabs streamed into Africa, fleeing the campaigns of the Christians. In the following year, Al-Mutamad, the governor of Seville, joined them. Visiting Yusuf, he begged him to assist the Muslims in Spain against the Christian onslaught. Yusuf responded. He raised an army that was said to have included every ethnic group in the western desert and sent them across the sea into Spain. Armed with Indian swords and mounted on camels, the African army faced the Christians at Zalaka in 1086. They triumphed and pushed the Christians out of the southern Spain. In time, Yusuf's forces seized Seville and dethroned its Islamic rules. Apparently, they had become sunk in pleasure and sloth. The Almoravid Empire had a court in Africa centered in Marrakesh and a court in Spain centered in Seville. This, according to Lady Luggard, established once more a supreme sultan upon the throne of Andalusia. Furthermore, Yusuf's conquest and the dynasty which he founded must be regarded as African conquest and African dynasty. Incidentally, there is a traditional image of Yusuf that appears on the Catalan Atlas, a famous Spanish map of the slightly later period. Not only is he clearly depicted as Negro, but he is portrayed as darker in complexion than Mansa Musa, incongruously drawn on the same map. The territory ruled by the Almoravides in Africa and Spain was extensive. Under their sway were the lands of Senegal, Morocco, Algeria, and Spain. It was a larger area that was of Western Europe. 13 kings acknowledged the overlordship of Yusuf. In Africa, Yusuf had great monuments built. 3 great mosques date from his time: the Mosque of Telmakin, the Mosque of Nedroma, and the Mosque of Algiers. He was also built an imposing stone fortress in Marrakesh, which other buildings at the time were of clay. Natasha Kubish notes that he founded the city of Marrakesh in 1062 and laid out the great palm grove, but then he handed over the further developments of the city to his son. Marrakesh remained the capital of the empire under the Almohades and is one of the 4 royal cities of Morocco, alongside Rabat, Fez, and Meknès. It is still a fascinating city today because of the African character and its surviving medieval buildings. The Almoravides probably introduced golden coinage into Europe. From the 12th century, the Christian Spaniards minted golden coinage in imitation of the Almoravide coin. The following century, mints in Florence, Genoa, Marseille, and Venice turned out golden coinage in imitation of those of the Christian Spaniards. In the 14th century, golden coinage makes its appearance in parts of northern Europe. According to Al-Idrisi, Wangarian, i.e. Guinean, gold was minted at some place. Guinean gold was minted at some place in the extreme west of Africa in the 12th century and put into circulation. This may well have been the source of the Almoravid coins. Ali ibn Yusuf, son of Yusuf ibn Tashfin, ruled from 1106. As ruler, his thinking was very guided by the ideas of legal scholars at the time. These scholars, however, have become very conservative and traditionally minded. They objected to the new ideas of Cordovian philosopher Al-Ghazali. Following their lead, Ali Al-Ghazali's books publicly burned. As ever, challenges came from the Christians of the north. To fight them, Ali raised taxes to pay for military spending. The tax increase proved an unpopular policy, and unrest spread in the cities. Despite this, Ali successfully countered the military actions of the Christian king Alfonso I of Aragon and Navarre. In July 1134, Ali defeated him at Flourished. Challenges now came from the west. The earldom of Portugal became independent in 1139. This territory later expanded into a kingdom. Tashfin ibn Ali inherited his father's throne in 1143. He faced major challenges from the Almohades, a new religious movement spreading among the Berbers in Africa. They seized Iran in Algeria in 1145 and Marrakesh in April 1147. In 1146, they crossed into Spain. The Almoravid dynasty came quickly to an end. The story of this new movement begins with a religious reformer called Ibn Tamur. He was a Masmuda Berber from the Atlas mountain region of Morocco. Of these people, Brunson Rashidi wrote that the Masmuda Berbers were described as blacks by Abu Shama in his Kitab al-Ravdatana. In 1106, Ibn Tumar studied in Cordova and also traveled to the east to complete his religious education. On his return, he preached against the ideas dominant among the Almoravid establishment. The Almoravides tended to literarize the Quran and to anthropomorphize the idea of God. He was preached against their lax and luxurious lifestyle. In time, a small band of devotees gathered about him. Before long, a new movement was born with both a religious and political program. Ibn Tumar called them the Unitarians. In Spanish accounts, they are called the Almohades. Ibn Tumar himself was declared to be the Mahdi, the Messiah. Among the Mahdi died 1130. The movement he founded grew. Abd al-Rahman, another Masuda Berber, took control of the movement in 1133. A brilliant organizer, he unified the various Berber groups, not just the Masmuda, into a cohesive force. In time, a power struggle took place between the Almoravid establishment and the newly rising Almohades. The newcomers triumphed. In 1147, they seized Marrakesh and executed the last Almoravid monarch. Abd al-Rahman commissioned the great Qutubiyya Mosque. There was a symbol of his conquest over the Almoravides. By 1150, he became master of Spain. Thus, for a second time, wrote Lady Luggard, a purely African dynasty reigned upon the most civilized throne of Europe. By 1160, his armies took control of Tunisia and penetrated Libya. These actions gained control of trade routes. Dr. Basil Davidson explained that the Maghreb blossomed once again. Moreover, cities like Fez and Slemlin rivaled the urban beauty and learning of Granada and Cordova, and unsurpassed by now throughout the Western world. Abu Yakub Yusuf became the next ruler in 1163. Like his father, he ruled the Almohad Empire, mostly from Marrakesh and Morocco. Taking scholarship seriously, he funded the greatest Islamic thinker of the age, Ibn Rushd, also called Averroes. He appointed the great thinker to the post of the high court judge in Cordova. Additionally, he appointed Ibn Tufail, another great scholar of the time, to be his personal doctor and prime minister in Marrakesh. He also began the transformation of the city of Seville into a great, prosperous city. This great ruler died in July 1184, followed a campaign against the Christian ruler of Leon. Yusuf Yakub al-Mansur, his son and successor, was an able and praiseworthy monarch, but he faced great challenges. In Africa, his armies became embroiled in costly civil war with Berber rebels. For a while, Tunisia became independent of Almohad power. In Spain, he tightened the screws on non-Muslims. Through high taxation, he forced many of them to leave. Almohad-controlled territory for the Christian regimes to the north. In Africa, and Spain, his government launched vast public works programs, building mosques, schools, hospitals, and aqueducts. He founded the Moroccan city of Rabat and also noted cities such as Alcazar and Mansoura. In Rabat, some of the great buildings are still standing. Dr. Namadi Ella, the architectural scholar, wrote that the incomplete minaret of the Hassan Mosque remains a major landmark and dominates the city. Built in the Almohad style, its enormous base suggests that it would have been one of the tallest minarets if it had been completed. The gate of the Uwada Kasbah is another edifice that shows the Islamic style of the Almohads. The majestic gate symbolizes Yakub al-Mansur's desire to make Rabat his capital. Ali ibn Abdallah, a 14th century historian, made a valuable assessment of this ruler's career. His reign was remarkable for the tranquility, the safety, the abundance, and the prosperity that reigned everywhere. His government was excellent. He increased the treasury. His power is exalted. His actions that of the most noble ruler. His religion was sincere and deep, and he was a great benefactor of Islam. The Spanish city of Seville flourished exceedingly under the rule of the Almoravides and the Almohades from 1086 to 1248 AD. This city stood at the heart of the Moorish administrative machine. Even today, the faint echo of the African presence is seen in the standing monuments of the city and is even marked on the complexions of the Seville population. Gary Young, writing in The Guardian, observed that, in terms of racial origin, local folk may define themselves in a number of different ways, but white they most definitely are not. You can see the rich, historical mix in their faces. Seville became a fine city of famous gardens, squares, and a suspension of bridge. It had good streets lined with magnificent buildings and spacious houses. Their courtyards were planted with trees and bore oranges, lemons, and other fruits. The city boasted a population of perhaps 500,000 people, a massive number for a medieval metropolis. In size, only Cordova, Baghdad, Eredo, and Cairo could compete. The river at Seville, its banks covered with overarching trees, laced through a semi-urbanized district of farmhouses, high towers, castles, and clusters of buildings for a distance of 30 miles. A delightful boating river, it connected together what must have seemed like one large city. Pleasure boats and large trading vessels traversed its ports and quays. The Alcazar and the great palace of the Almahad Sultans. They built it in 1181 on a site that dated back to Roman times. Walls surrounded the palace on one side that reached down to the river. Today, only one of the great towers has survived intact. Later European kings have added to the rest of the structure, destroying its original integrity. Of the original features, however, Cecilia Hill, author of Moorish Towns in Spain, tells us that the Court of Maidens was particularly impressive. It is a study of delicate coloring and elaborate sculpture wrought by Moors. She further informs us that the court is surrounded by a dado azulejos that have the luster of polished metal. The inner wall was almost covered with stone arabesques, delicately and yet firmly cut on blue ground. The roof was of carved wood, richly gilt and many-colored. Finally, the throne was located under the central wider arch with rich work in gold. More impressive, however, was the Giralda of Seville. Originally conceived as a minaret for the great mosque, Caliph al-Mansur built it in 1196. The minaret itself is 350 feet high, with each side measuring 50 feet. Most of its surface is smooth and unbroken. Only towards the summit of this tower were windows built. Some of these windows have simple horseshoe arches. Others on a higher tier have little columns of white marble. The whole impression given is one of grace and simple elegance. According to Cecilia Hill, it is the highest ancient building made solely of brick. Today, the minaret is adjoined to the Seville Cathedral, apparently the largest Gothic cathedral in the world. Cecilia Hill informs us that it fills the exact site of the ancient mosque. Consequently, very little is left of the old African-built monument. Of the little that remains today, however, is the north wall of the cathedral, the octagonal fountain in the forecourt, and the 100 shafts of columns that surround the cathedral precincts. and its doors of bronze. In other words, a great whole chunk of the largest Gothic cathedral in the world is the Great Mosque of Seville, as built by African Sultan Al-Mansur. Seville had an impressive reputation for science and art that was second only to that of Cordova. Even bishops of Christ flocked to the university to study. Of the great scholars of the city were Al-Beji, the sage, Al-Idrisi, author of an encyclopedia of the sciences, and Averroes, the great philosopher. The fall of Moorish power. In the early 13th century, however, things fell apart. Again, there was African-Arab disunity, caused by Arab prejudice. Arab poet Abu Ghaffar, for example, refused the post of Secretary of Granada because he did not wish to work alongside Sultan Abid Al-Rahman's son. Abu Ghaffar felt that the dark-skinned Berber seemed to him far below his own intellectual standards. Meanwhile, the European translation centers of Moorish and Arabic texts, established in the 10th century, has borne fruit. By the 12th and 13th centuries, there was a rise of the major European universities. Bologna University, Italy, was established in 1158. Montpellier, France, in 1180. Oxford, England, in 1200. Toulouse, France, in 1223. Rome, Italy, in 1245. And Cambridge, England, in 1257. Arguably, this process began the genesis of European Renaissance. In Africa, various peoples began to secede from the empire beginning in 1216. By 1269, Almohad power in Africa had vanished. The Maronides became the new power in Morocco. Abu Hassan Ali, 1335-1351, also called Al-Sultan Aswad, i.e. the Black Sultan, was its greatest builder. He founded many of the cities in Morocco that exist today. In particular, he built great monuments in Fez, such as the madrasas and the like. Moreover, Moroccan art and literature rose to the zenith under his patronage. His tomb is one of the architectural treasures of Morocco. In Spain, the Christians seized Cordova in 1236, Valencia in 1238, Murcia in 1243, Jaén in 1245, and Seville in 1248. Additionally, the Almohades were overthrown in Spain to be replaced by the new Islamic powers. The Nasrids established the city of Granada as the last stronghold of Moorish power in Spain. Stanley Lane Poole presented the relevant facts with typical accuracy. The Kingdom of Granada was the last bulwark of the Moors in Spain. It was not much that was now left to them. Between 1238 and 1260, Fernando III of Castile and Jaime I of Aragon conquered Valencia, Cordova, Seville, and Murcia, and the ruler of the Moors was now restricted to the present province of Granada, i.e. the country about the Sierra Nevada and the seacoast from Almeria to Gibraltar. Within this limit, however, their kingdom was destined to endure for another 2 centuries and a half. Though hemmed on all sides, the Moors were well served by soldiers. The people of the conquered cities, the most valiant warriors of the vanquished Muslim states, came to place their swords at the disposal of one remaining Mohammedan king. 50,000 Moors are recorded to have fled to his protection from Valencia, and 300,000 from Seville, Cerces, and Cadiz. Nevertheless, Granada was forced to become tributary to the Castilian crown. The founder of the dynasty of the Beni Nasir, i.e. Nasrids, an Arab named Ibn al-Ammar, or the Red Man, because of his fair skin and hair, was a vigorous sovereign, but he could not withstand the power of the Christians, who now held nearly the whole of Spain. He paid homage and tributes to Fernando and his son Alfonso the Learned, not, however, without more than one struggle to free himself from their yoke, and from that time forward Granada, with its surrounding territory, was generally let alone by the Christian kings. Despite the light complexion of the ruling class, European writers remembered the masses of the Moors of Granada as Negroes. In 1686, De Fontenelle, a French writer, described the Moors of Granada as a small black people, burned by the sun, full of wit and fire, always in love, writing verse, fond of music, arranging festivals, dances, and tournaments every day. The greatest achievement of the Kingdom of Granada was the Alhambra Palace. Of this great monument, Cecilia Hill wrote the following. In the Alhambra, we come to the perfection of the Moorish art, or let us say, to the greatest extant example of Moorish art in Spain. It has become one of the common heritages of the world, even to the unlettered and untraveled. The word Moor suggests not Seville or Cordova, but Granada, and Granada means the Alhambra. In Granada, we shall feel ourselves as holy in Islam as out of Africa it is possible to feel. It is because of the Alhambra. Located on an outcrop of the Sierra Nevada, the palace was built on a site 720 meters by 220 meters. Surrounded by a wall broken by 23 towers, the complex consisted of 7 palaces, houses for all social classes, offices, a mint, workshops, prisons, mosques, public baths, a royal necropolis, and Torres Bermeja, the Generalife, and the fortress. Begun in 1377, the Court of the Lions is a particular splendid part of complex. On the entering, wrote Cecilia Hill, we stand amid a small labyrinth of columns, under a roof of stalactites in stone, amid which we must imagine suspended lamps with scented oil spreading a soft light. There is a forest of lovely columns, especially at the 2 ends where the number is increased by a pavilion with small dome on one of them, and colored tiles in the court of myrtles. The exquisite delicacy, seeming fragility of these columns, that seem to be made of pink ivory, and of the stonework of the arcades above, worked like lace, is due to the fact that arches were never used by the Moors for structural purposes, but simply for ornament. In the bright sunshine of the center, supporting a round double fountain, stand 12 famous lions spouting water and watching us as they watch the Moors. After 1417, however, Muslim leader in Granada became more and more unstable. There were short-lived reigns, factional fighting, and the emirs achieving power by Christian backing. A more sinister threat came after 1469. The kingdoms of the Christians, Aragon and Castile, have become united by the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. From 1484 onwards, they campaigned against the Moors and gradually closed in on the city of Granada. In 1491, they blockaded the city. The Moors finally capitulated. On 2nd January 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella entered Granada, but as its masters. They exiled Abu Abdallah, the last Moorish king, to Africa, where his descendants learned to beg their daily bread. 4 years later, King Manuel of Portugal, the neighboring country, ordered the expulsion of its African population. The expulsions from both lands continued up until the time of King Philip III, who completed the policy in 1609. It is stated, wrote Professor Lane Poole, that no less than 3 millions of Moors were banished between the fall of Granada and the first decade of the 17th century. Some returned to the North and West Africa, but others fled elsewhere in Europe, where they were gradually absorbed. Professor Lane Poole commented upon the sagaciousness of the expulsion policies. In 1492, the last bulwark of the Moors gave way before the crusade of Ferdinand and Isabella, and with Granada fell all Spain's greatness. For a brief while, indeed, the reflection of the Moorish splendor cast a borrowed light upon the history of the land which it had warmed with its sunny radiance. The great epic of Isabella, Charles V, and Philip II, of Columbus, Cortez, and Pizarro, shed a last halo about the dying monuments of mighty state. They followed the abomination of desolation, the rule of Inquisition, and the blackness of darkness in which Spain has plunged ever since. In the land where science was once supreme, the Spanish doctors became noted for nothing but their ignorance and incapacity, and the discoveries of Newton and Harvey were condemned as pernicious to the faith. Where once 70 public libraries had fed the minds of scholars, 500,000 books have been gathered together at Cordova for the benefit of the world. Such indifference to learning afterwards prevailed that the new capital, Madrid, possessed no public library in the 18th century, and even the manuscripts of Escurial were denied in our own days, i.e. 1886. For the first scholarly historian of the Moors, though himself a Spaniard, the 16,000 looms of Seville soon dwindled to a fifth of their ancient number. The arts and industries of Toledo and Almeria faded into insignificance. The very baths, public buildings of equal ornament and use, were destroyed because cleanliness savored too strongly of rank infidelity. The land, deprived of its skillful irrigation of the Moors, grew impoverished and neglected. The richest and most fertile valleys languished and were deserted. Most of the populous cities which filled every district of Andalusia fell into ruinous decay, and beggars, friars, and bandits took the place of scholars, merchants, and knights. So low fell Spain after she had driven away the Moors. Such is the melancholy contrast offered by her history. Commenting on this passage, Professor Maluna Karenga, the rigorous African-American scholar, wrote that, "It is interesting to note that after all the commentaries on and claims about the tragedy that would descend on Africans if and when Europeans left Africa, it was a major European state, Spain, that deteriorated after Africans left. Such is the irony and severe instruction of history."